Then Joshua, son of Nun, sent 2 men secretly as spies, saying, "Go view the land, especially Jericho." So they went and entered the house of a prostitute, whose name was Rahab, and spent the night there. The king of Jericho was told, "Some Israelites have come here tonight to search out the land." Then the king of Jericho sent orders to Rahab, "Bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out the whole land." But the woman took the 2 men and hid them. Then she said, "True, the men came to me, but I did not know where they came from." And when it was time to close the gate at dark, the men went out. Where the men went, I do not know. Pursue them quickly, for you can overtake them. She had, however, brought them up to the roof and hidden them in what she had laid out on the roof. So the men pursued them on the way to the Jordan as far as the fords. As soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. Before they went to sleep, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, "I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that dread of you has fallen on us, and all the inhabitants of the land melt in fear before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea before when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, whom you utterly destroyed. As soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no courage left in any of us because of you. The Lord your God is indeed God in heaven, above and on earth below. Now then, since I have dealt kindly with you, swear to me, to your God, that you will deal kindly with my family. Give me a good sign of good faith that you would spare my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death." Then the men said to her, "Our life is yours. If you do not tell this business of ours, then we will deal kindly and faithfully with you when the Lord gives us this land." Then she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was on the outer side of the city wall, and she resided within the wall itself. She said to them, "Go towards the hill country, so that the pursuers may not come upon you. Hide yourselves there 3 days until the pursuers have returned, and then afterwards you can go on your way." The men said to her, "We will be released from this oath that you have made us swear to you, if we invade the land and you do not tie this crimson cord in the window through which you let us down, and you do not gather into your house your father and mother, your brothers, and all of your family. If any of you go out of the doors of your house into the street, they shall be responsible for their own death, and we shall be innocent. But if a hand is laid upon any who are with you in this house, we shall bear the responsibility. But if you tell this business of ours, then we will be released from this oath." And she said, "According to your words, so be it." She sent them away, and they departed. Then she tied the crimson cord in the window. They departed and went into the hill country, stayed there for 3 days, until the pursuers returned. They had searched all around the way and found nothing. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, what is this story? Making room. Rahab's challenge to us, the faithful. Like I said, a very complicated story. Something is about to happen that is bound to make us uncomfortable, not only because we are years away from it, but because it is a very destructive and dangerous story. It asks questions about God and God's view of violence and all kinds of things, and God's call to those who ultimately committed genocide to a land. And I'm not going to be able to answer all of those questions here today. But Rahab is very interesting in this very complicated backdrop. Rahab is one of the most interesting women in the Bible, though she is a little bit more known in Christian circles. I'm sure at least some of you here have heard of her. Like other women that we have studied so far, her story is also not included at all in the lectionary. Not once. And so, if you want to talk about Rahab, you've really got to circumvent the systems that have been set out for us, the cycle of texts that have been laid out for us. She does have a name that we know, but she still has very little power or voice in her situation. Even her place of residence is very telling to us. The scripture points out that her house was on the outer side of the city wall, and she resided within the wall itself. You can't get more marginalized than literally living in the outer walls of a city. And at first reading, it seems very peculiar that in this war that is about to happen, these spies would take refuge and counsel from such a person who was a Canaanite, their literal enemy, someone who was a woman, who in that society would have been a second-class citizen, and then 3, someone who is called a prostitute, one of the lowest and considered immoral members of their society. But what becomes very clear as we continue our study is that she had faith. I wonder what we might make of the fact that almost every time Rahab's name is mentioned, her profession of sex work is attached to it. There's a couple ways of looking at this. On the one hand, there was this long-standing shame of this part of Rahab's life. In fact, some rabbinic texts translate it as innkeeper and don't talk about it at all. On the other hand, there are some who freely use the word prostitute in order to make her appear immoral in particular ways. They are quick to attach her sinful lifestyle to her name in a way that is not necessarily done to men in our tradition. For example, in Hebrews 11, Rahab is included in the list of faithful people, but the prostitute is attached to it in a way that isn't true of the men. So King David is, for example, not called David the murderer or David the adulterer. Samson was not identified as the gullible guy who was tricked by Delilah. Japheth, someone who sacrificed his own daughter, is not labeled Japheth, the incredibly stupid father. Men in this list of faithful people are described only by their faithful actions. And what I think is interesting about this, the perspective of not wanting to talk about it at all and the perspective of talking about it only because of shame, is that neither of these perspectives really hold together the nuance of the situation, which is that we don't really know what led Rahab to her profession. The Bible talks about it in a very neutral kind of way, one identifier among many. We don't really know that much about it. She could have simply been desperate to survive and provide for her family. She could have been trafficked. She could have freely chosen this path for herself. We don't know. Rahab, like many women in ancient society and across the world today, navigated a male-dominated society with limited options at her disposal, and none of the perspectives that really talk about her are able to hold those tensions. But what we do know is that Rahab is named 3 times in the New Testament. The first time, if you can believe it, is in Matthew 1, where she is mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus, one of several women listed in his family name. She is also mentioned, as I said, in Hebrews 11 as a model of faith. Interesting that Rahab is mentioned here and not Joshua, who is the name of the entire book. The author of Hebrews says about her, "By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish because she received the spies in peace." And then she is also mentioned in James chapter 2 as an example of good works, saying, "Was not Rahab the prostitute also justified by works when she welcomed the messengers and sent them out by another road?" Though the authors may have been quick to add shame to Rahab's legacy, the Bible itself lifts her up as this example of wisdom and courage and hospitality. Her story is remembered because of her unexpected faith and her radical hospitality. The spies who came to her seeking refuge were strangers who actually intended to destroy her entire city, and yet Rahab, for some reason, deals kindly with them. She showed them openness and steadfast love, hesed, which is a word that kind of means kindness, but is usually only used for God's actions. She not only housed them, but she lied about their whereabouts in order to keep them safe, these people who were sent to destroy her. She took this incredible risk and put herself in danger in order to care for people that she really didn't know. Sure, she was desperate and had very little to lose. Her options were she could betray her people and aid in the genocide of an entire city, or just die alongside the society that's continued to marginalize her and see her as a second-class citizen. Her options aren't really all that great. But still, she quickly thinks on her feet and chooses the side of welcome. She chooses the side to make room in her heart, in her life, and her home for these strangers along the road. And the text even says that Rahab acted primarily because of her faith. As she speaks about what she believes and she enters into this negotiation with the men, it's interesting to me that she has one of the longest uninterrupted statements by a woman in the Bible. This foreign woman, who is a sex worker, was spiritually perceptive enough to recognize the power of God at work among the Israelites. She has enough wisdom to know that there is something bigger than her and something bigger than them that is powering the situation. At some point, she had heard about the people of God. Perhaps she had even witnessed their worship above the wall, or maybe she had gotten a peek at the size of their army. And somehow she was convinced that they had not crossed the Red Sea or defeated their enemies based on their own power. And here she is, someone who is not even an Israelite, but she saw clearly that God was at work, that God was the source of their strength. Similarly, in our culture, there are people who do not identify with any religion at all and yet demonstrate incredible insight about faith and grace. Because of her faith, Rahab is ultimately spared from destruction, but most importantly, she is embraced by God. While it may be inspirational to claim that this fallen Rahab finds God and turns her life around, the text does not say this at all. She does not join the church. She does not become an Israelite. As far as we know, she is not transformed or converted in the ways that we would expect. It is not made clear anywhere that she becomes an Israelite. Instead, she and her family live as perpetual outsiders. Although they are saved, they still live always at the margins of Israel. And so it's not really a story about transformation in the way that we would expect. Instead, Rahab's story is a reminder that God is much more interested in our openness and willingness than our spiritual resume. And Rahab didn't have to clean up her act in order to be worthy of God's love and God's curiosity about her. She makes room for these strangers, and God makes room for her. So some of you know I have this preaching group that I get together with every week. And this past week we were talking about this, and I found myself really curious about the meaning of Rahab's name. I was like, maybe there's something to that. And so we were talking about it for a while, and then I became obsessed with it and was pulling out lexicons, language resources. And after a brief search, it was easy to see how, taken at face value, some may have translated her name into something like pride or rebellion, but then just stopped. And I wasn't quite satisfied with that. I was like, no, there's got to be something deeper. And so my friend Alex and I went back and forth. And then eventually he texted me a long list of more possibilities and more definitions. And at first, I saw the word broad. And at first I thought, broad? Like the way that people call women? Broad as in like large, like physically? What does that have to do with anything? But then I kept scanning the page. Next to broad, I saw spacious, to open wide, and then to make room for. And then we both got really excited and we were texting each other word after word. Wait, stop, that's it. There's something really interesting about that. To make room for. This definition stuck out to me, almost as if Rahab's name itself was a reflection of her willingness to embrace a broad perspective and make room for those who were outsiders. And also maybe that her name is an invitation to face our own prejudices about who can be included and who can hold truth. Her legacy perhaps is so significant that it calls us to pay attention to those coming after her, who exist outside of our faith communities. And so at one point, my friend Alex texted and said, what if Rahab's role is to literally make room for others outside of the church to become part of God's work in the world? And I said, could it be that this story is not about Rahab's conversion, but ours? In other words, who and in what ways do we allow ourselves to be transformed by unexpected people and unexpected places? In what ways do we allow ourselves to be inspired by people that we think can teach us nothing about God, those people who live on the outer walls? Rahab's story is a reminder that the church does not have a monopoly on God. Truth can come from unexpected places, those people that we think are too far gone, or those people who fall outside of a certain set of beliefs. Faith can have many faces, backgrounds. Do we allow ourselves to make room? How does it land with us, mostly people of relative power and privilege, that God often doesn't use us? God often works through people who are not us. God often uses other people other than us to say a word, to be a model. That sometimes our models for faith can be found outside of our walls. But on the other hand, when it comes to God, isn't that not all that surprising? In the scriptural tradition itself, God sometimes surprises us by choosing the second son rather than the first son, or using the Canaanite woman to teach Jesus a lesson, or using the Ethiopian eunuch as one of the first converts to the faith. All of these unexpected people. Apparently, the God we worship just revels in the people outside of the walls. When I was in pastoral training, I had the opportunity to hear the gospel from women in recovery, from people in psych hospitals, and people in homeless shelters. The problem was most of the time they weren't listened to because of their background or their job or because of where they lived, kind of like Rahab. And sometimes it was even because of how they said something, whether it was broken English or a lot of slang or through a string of cuss words, or even said in a state of distress. There was a reason that they were pushed to the margin and not listened to. All of those things that might determine whether or not we consider somebody that we can look up to. Some of those people that I got to meet belonged to faith communities and some of them didn't. But it was in these situations that I learned how to pay attention in a new way. And I learned the importance of expanding my view and making room for someone to even teach a pastoral intern something that I had never considered about God. For myself to be transformed by unexpected people and unexpected circumstances. A ministry colleague at Trinity Presbyterian Church in Charlotte wrote these words, quote, "The Rahabs of the world are a powerful reminder that there is nothing special about us, or more to the point, nothing more special than anyone else. And because of that, the answers do not always lie with just us. Because of that, we must align ourselves with those living in the outer walls. Because of that, our job as people of faith is to actively see the bigger picture, the depth of God's work in the world, and stay tuned in to God's agenda instead of our own." End quote. One of the church's biggest misconceptions is that we have to bring God to others, rather than understanding that God is already everywhere. Our true calling is to recognize how God is already there and already at work. Rahab's faith challenges us to reevaluate our biases, to be open to God's ability to speak through anyone, regardless of any stigma that may be attached to their identity, their profession, where they come from. And we do this by intentionally putting ourselves in places where we can hear other voices, hear other perspectives. We do this by putting ourselves in new environments, by consuming different media and inviting others to the table of our everyday lives. We do this by consciously putting ourselves in situations where we're learning from those we've been taught to fear or misunderstand. To challenge ourselves to conjure up feelings of awe, admiration, and reverence in places that are not church, but are still instructive and transformative for us. Who are those people that we think have nothing to teach us about faith? Those are the exact people that God is pointing us to. Rahab teaches us the importance of making room for them in our psyches, in our hearts, in our lives, to be amazed, to be instructed, to be humbled. And so perhaps the story is not about Rahab's conversion, but ours. Amen. And so now is your opportunity to share things that are bubbling up in you, ways that this message might be moving in you.
Thank you for such wonderful reflections on this person. I've always wondered, however, why she was called a harlot. A young woman living by herself outside of the city, or on the borders of the city. The general population would have just assumed that she was and had to be a harlot. But there's no evidence of anything like that in the whole story. And she is honored in many ways by being remembered so well in the Bible and in the genealogy of Jesus.
Right.
And so there's something very peculiar going on here. And I wondered whether that was a stigma that was attached to her by the patriarchs who told the story. The only thing they could think of about a woman living where she was living, that she had to be a harlot in order to support herself. Maybe whoever sort of referred to her as an innkeeper
Right.
was on the better track.
Mm.
And that doesn't take away anything from what you were saying at all, but yet it does raise questions, I think, about her designation.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is like we don't know, and it seems like there's been different impulses, like I was saying, to either ignore it or make it better or to not talk about it. I mean, these are all done very differently for different reasons, wanting to emphasize different things about her. And I think regardless of any of that, it's being able to undo the stigma of it, not feel shame about it. But letting it be a fairly neutral part of her, that there's other things about her that made her remembered.
Kind of tacking onto that, and I know that what you said was just very powerful, but what I find interesting about her too is she had some sort of relationship with her family, right? So she wasn't shunned by her family, or if she was, she still cared so dearly about them, and they had enough relationship. And she also, when she came to them, lots of times there's different biblical things where somebody may share their shame. They may be like, I'm not worthy. She never says that. She never says, God wouldn't find me adequate.
Right.
She's like, your God will protect me if you protect me. So she was confident. I mean, whatever she was, she had that behind her, and she wasn't broken away from her family enough, unless she's like, I'm gonna prove to them. I mean, there could be some other nuances, but it seems like she comes straight to that. And it is also interesting, though, she doesn't say my kids or my husband.
Right.
She goes to those other extended families. So it does seem that she was alone for whatever reason.
Right.
But I do think it's so powerful that, and then also these two spies listen to her. They're like, we owe you our life, but also they don't say, oh, well, you're below dirt.
Yeah.
You're not worthy of our God. Or, I mean, there's that humanity between these individuals,
Right.
as far as, and I think that's very powerful, is they don't judge.
Right.
They can see the connection that they have made and how she has saved their life, and that there's value in her.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I mean, very, very powerful woman. I mean, like you said, there's a lot of confidence there, and there's a lot of boldness and assurance that they're going to listen. But yeah, the part about her family is true. I mean, she clearly does have some kind of family. She doesn't seem married. She doesn't mention a husband. But there are members that she is concerned about taking care of. And so that also makes it powerful, because if any of those family members are men, she wouldn't necessarily be the spokesperson for them, but she is. And that also speaks to her character.
Another thing that crosses my mind about how does she have all this knowledge is, we were down in New Orleans. We didn't get to do a lot of stuff that I've done before, but it brought back some memories, like about Marie Laveau and being this voodoo priestess. But she was also very in tune to, as a servant, as a slave. She was privy to hearing the goings-ons of lots of different powerful people. So she knew things because she heard things. And the same thing, whether she was a prostitute or whether she was an innkeeper, people traveled through her space. She heard stories. People, if she was a prostitute, maybe shared stuff when they were, laying in bed or whatever, that she got information. And so she understood politics and the goings-ons of the world because of travelers. So that made her wiser and more learned.
That's a really, really good point. Yeah. I mean, I think that whatever she was, for some reason, she was on the outer walls of the city. For some reason, she wasn't worthy enough to be where other people were. But also because of her location, she had some insight. She knew about Israel. She had, some knowledge about who they were and when they were coming. And, I think you're right that she was one of the first places that you would go through to get to the city. But there's got to be some reason why she was on the outskirts. Yeah, Barbara.
Yes, I was thinking, and thank you. That was, like Heather said, very powerful. To comment on a very small section of what you said was her name. And I've been very interested my whole life about the names that people have, why they were chosen to have that name. Was it just out of the blue, or was it after someone? And then you realize that so many people with the name, if they look it up, they do have characters of where the origin of the name came from. Saint Barbara was, she was a saint, so maybe my mother knew something, but you feel too like you have to live up to it. Like when I investigated it more and more and more, and I started talking to people, and I actually gave a talk on your name, and like when people answer the phone, I'm and like, what's your name? What's your name? It's like people are ashamed to, I gave a talk to all the teachers, and I said, be proud of your name. Like the first thing you should say is, my name is Barbara. Nice and loud so everybody can hear it. But people tend to mumble it.
Yeah.
But it's who you are.
Right.
And you have to know who you are to teach others. And that just, what you said, just sparked all that in me. So I'm churning up on what I used to do about the name of somebody. So it's very interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think in the Bible and in many societies, the names are very important and spiritual. And I don't know what it was about this week, but I was like, I have to know what it means. And also knowing that many names have different definitions, and knowing like which ones people attach themselves to affects their interpretation, right? And so being able to say, oh no, there's another one there, and that's also really like characteristic of her. And so it can be a really powerful thing to use names to like tear someone down or uplift them. So that was, definitely really, really fascinating, and something we should always ask about the Bible, because lots of their names are reflective of their journeys.
I really like the making the room and excuse me. And a couple of things occurred to me. One, just starting to read Native, and also recently reading a book called The Wind Is My Mother, who was written by a Native American, what we would call medicine man. He doesn't call himself that. And the wisdom of the indigenous culture in the United States is amazing, and how, in some ways, so much more pure than Christianity in my mind. But the other thing that struck me when you were talking about how we tend not to listen to what other people have to say, and you said somebody in recovery, in the rooms, in Al-Anon, in the rooms, there's anonymity. So often you don't know what a person's job is, what their background is, and that allows, I think, for a lot more acceptance of what people say. And often somebody will come in, it'll be their first meeting, and they'll blow everybody away with what they have to say, and you're like, where did that come from? But it's just a reminder that sometimes you have to look past all those other things that often get in the way, as you said.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful example. I've experienced that too. Like there's something about like almost being forced to take away labels and things that can add to that empathy and listening. But yeah, for sure, I think that's one of the takeaways is, not only that names are important to look at, but also this idea of paying attention to voices that we don't often want to. But yeah, any other thoughts?
Yeah, this is just putting together, I think, a reiteration of what's been said, but I agree with you. The more I think about it, it's more likely that she was an innkeeper because it explains why they would go there, why the people of the city would come to her and say, were they here? Um, to me, it just makes a lot more sense in terms of the story of why they would come to her. I mean, would people say, go to the prostitute's house as you're going through the city? And that maybe they did, but I don't know. I mean, what were the reasons in those days why a woman who was not married and didn't have children yet had a family would be living alone?
Mm-hmm.
You've got to know what was going on in that time.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you guys do, but it just, prostitute's one reason, but an innkeeper would be another reason.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that we don't know. I mean, I think there's possibilities for both. I think what I want to point out is, it shouldn't be shame that keeps us from naming the prostitution. But there are other reasons why it could have been a different profession. It could have been, that they knew that she housed people. It could have also been that they knew, that she had access to people and she had access to information. It could have been that maybe she had, she was known for her hospitality, even when she wasn't working, she housed people and had food that they liked, or it could be a number of things. So I don't think it's for sure one or the other, but just want us to be aware of how we choose one for certain reasons and how that might reflect bias one way or the other. But definitely evidence for either one.
The other thing that I like the wording of, and we all know at least one other place where it was used in the Bible, is that they left by a different way. I just think this idea of being pursued and how to escape.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we can, widen that to a lot of things in our lives when we have to make changes.
Mm-hmm.
I love that phrase.
Yeah.
Left by a different way.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it's a beautiful phrase used for a story of someone who was a part of Jesus's lineage. Is really, really interesting, really beautiful. But yeah, any other thoughts or questions or things bubbling up? Anyone? I don't see any comments on Zoom.
I just, when, in the previous conversation, the fact that is not in the lectionary.
Yeah.
I mean, when you think how many times she's been mentioned, and the fact that it's a pivotal story about taking over Jericho, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, the only reason I can think of it wasn't included is because of her label.
Right.
I mean, that,
Yeah.
I don't know. That just hit me again that you had said that, and there's no mention of it. I don't know.
It's very
shocking
weird.
to me.
Yeah, it's very weird. As loyal as I sometimes am to the lectionary, when I think about what it leaves out, it's very troubling. Those decisions that are made, often men, it's troubling. And I do think that part of it is the stigma. And it even makes it even more remarkable that she's mentioned many times in the New Testament, because her story actually isn't needed to tell the story of Jericho, right? It doesn't move the story forward. It's just kind of this little thing happened. It doesn't move the story forward at all. It's not necessary in that sense. And yet it is her name is repeated several times. And why don't we lift that up? Very bizarre. So I've learned how to, take with a grain of salt what the lectionary gives us to work with, and then use opportunities like this to have series to talk about these other people. But yeah.
we have on Zoom, Jasmine says, "Hey everyone, I was reminded of a movie quote where a man was asked if he believed in God, and his response was, 'Faith is a gift I have yet to receive.' The man goes on to be a hero of the movie, but it's an interesting perspective that lessons and blessing come in all forms. I love that freedom to find what God has for you anywhere."
Beautiful. Yeah. Yeah, I wonder how we might reflect on experiences we've had where we've been able to learn something from people outside of the church, which is our invitation. There's part of me that feels like, oh yeah, that's obvious, but sometimes isn't. You know, sometimes still have that impulse like, no, we have to bring God to them. Yeah, rather than God is already there, already everywhere that we're ever going to go. So yeah. Thank you so much for this conversation, and I hope that Rahab's challenge to us continues to do a good work. And we will move now to our